History carries a silence that feels heavier than stone, a silence not born of absence, but of secrets buried beneath centuries of dust. We often think of crime as something belonging to the present headlines flashing across screens. Names whispered with dread, but the truth is far older, far darker. Long before television, long before cameras, human jealousy, betrayal, and blood carved themselves into the earth in ways we cannot erase. Tonight we open a forgotten archive, a vault of crimes that history documented yet never solved in spirit, where every record feels incomplete and every confession leaves more questions than answers. These are not ghost stories, and yet they haunt. They are not myths, and yet they twist into legend. They are the true crimes that time refused to silence. Imagine a candlelit courtroom at the turn of the century, where the air is heavy with sweat, perfume, and suspicion, where jurors lean forward not to seek truth, but to satisfy curiosity. Imagine a body found in pieces in a quiet New England town, and a lover's name whispered in guilt before the rope ever touched his neck. Picture a bottle of poison slipping into a teacup on a grey English morning, its bitter taste hidden beneath. Sugar, while a husband gasps his last breaths in silence. These are stories of calculated malice, of impulses that shattered ordinary lives, of justice that may have been no justice at all. What lingers in these cases is not only the brutality of the acts, but the murkiness of what really happened. Some said the guilty were punished, others swore the innocent were condemned, and time, ever merciless, left us with nothing but fragments. Tonight we will not play judge or jury. We will listen. We will move from one crime to the next, across decades and oceans, through prison cells, poisoned kitchens, blood-soaked hillsides, and the echoing silence of execution grounds. And as we listen, we must ask ourselves, do these stories reveal the truth? Or do they reveal something darker about the hunger to peer into shadows, to hear tales of ruin, to imagine the weight of chains and the taste of guilt? Sit back, relax, and follow me into the past. But remember, history does not forgive, and it never forgets. In the autumn of 1934, in a quiet English village, a man named Arthur Major sat at his breakfast table, unaware that each bite carried him closer to the grave. His wife Ethel watched him carefully, her expression unreadable as the steam rose from the teacup she had prepared. Hours later, Arthur collapsed, his body seized by convulsions, his breath shallow, his skin pale as parchment. Doctors arrived, but the treatment was useless, for what coursed through his veins was not illness but poison strychnine, silent and merciless. The village whispered almost immediately. Some said Ethel had discovered her husband's affairs. Others suggested money had been her motive, and still others claimed she had grown weary of his temper. But in the courtroom that followed, motives mattered less than appearances, and Ethel's calm demeanor became its own weapon against her. The prosecution painted her as a cold, calculating woman who laced her husband's meals with death. The defense argued that she was a loyal wife, trapped in gossip and circumstance, condemned not by evidence but by suspicion. What lingered over the trial was not certainty, but doubt. Neighbors recalled her buying powders from chemists, but others swore she only sought medicine. Arthur's body revealed traces of strychnine, yet no one had seen her deliver it. The jury listened, torn between pity and horror, as the story unfolded like a play without a clear ending. When the verdict came guilty, the courtroom held its breath. Ethel Major was sentenced to death, her face pale, her eyes distant, as if she already stood halfway between this world and the next. But even as the noose awaited, debate raged. Was she truly a murderer, or was she a victim of circumstance? Condemned because society found her too composed, too different, too dangerous to be innocent. Newspapers turned her into a symbol, some painting her as a heartless killer, others as a tragic woman caught in the machinery of justice. And in the silence after her execution, the question lingered: was the real crime the poisoning of Arthur Major, or the certainty with which we condemned a woman whose guilt was never beyond doubt? Some researchers today call her case one of England's most chilling miscarriages of justice, while others insist she was every bit the poisoner the jury believed. But the truth, like the strychnine itself, remains invisible, dissolved in history, leaving only bitterness behind. The morning of Ethel Major's execution was grey and heavy, as if the sky itself bore the weight of what was about to happen. Outside the prison walls, small groups gathered, some out of morbid fascination, others out of quiet protest, all waiting for the moment when the bell would toll and a woman's life would be measured in silence. Inside, the air carried the sharp, metallic smell of iron and damp stone. Guards moved with mechanical precision, their faces void of expression, as if routine could shield them from conscience. Ethel, dressed in black, walked with a composure that unsettled those who witnessed it. No tears, no pleas, no collapse. A stillness that the newspapers later described as unnatural. Some called her defiance chilling, others called it bravery, but either way, it only deepened the mystery. As the rope was placed around her neck, she uttered no last words that could redeem or condemn her. The trapdoor opened, and within moments, the woman the press had named the block switch poisoner was gone. Outside, as news spread, public reaction divided sharply. Headlines screamed of justice served, of a murderous wife meeting her deserved fate, yet in whispers, doubts persisted. Was the evidence strong enough? Had the jury been swayed by gossip, by the sight of a woman too cold, too detached to fit society's mold of grief and innocence? Neighbors recalled her as polite but distant, a woman who did not weep openly when Arthur died. In an era where femininity was measured in softness and visible sorrow, her composure became her greatest crime. The press painted her portrait with ink dipped in fear and fascination, turning her into both villain and victim depending on the paper you read. And perhaps that is why her story refuses to settle into history quietly. To some, she remains the quintessential poisoner, a woman who turned domestic life into a theater of murder. To others, she is a cautionary tale of how perception can damn a person as thoroughly as any act. Decades later, criminologists still revisit her case, pointing to inconsistencies in the evidence and questioning whether the truth was ever fully uncovered. Yet the finality of the gallows allowed no appeals, no revisions, no second chances. All that remains is the echo of the drop, the ink of the newspapers, and the question that has never left: did Ethel Major truly kill her husband, or did history kill her instead? On a crisp spring morning in 1900, the town of Franklin, Massachusetts, stirred awake as it always did, with smoke curling from chimneys and the sound of wagon wheels clattering along dirt roads. Life moved slowly here, where neighbors knew each other's names and strangers stood out like broken glass on a polished floor. But in the shadows of Breakheart Hill, a place already whispered about for its desolate beauty and lonely paths, something would unfold that no one could ignore. George Bailey was a familiar figure, young, steady, and well like Chet. It was his sudden disappearance that would transform him into a legend of horror. He had last been seen in the company of John Courtney Best, a man whose presence carried an unease that words failed to capture. Best was not a stranger, yet he was not embraced. His reputation seemed built from fragments of gossip, half-truths, and a certain coldness in his eyes that neighbors never trusted. When George vanished, suspicion did not scatter. Wide it settled, almost immediately, on Best. Rumors spread like smoke through the town, filling taverns, kitchens, and church pews. Whispers told of an argument, of jealousy, of something darker, binding the two men together. Some said it was about money, others suggested rivalry over a woman, and a few hinted at secrets no one dared voice aloud. As days turned into weeks, the quiet countryside became a hunting ground for truth. Families carried lanterns along the wooded trails, calling George's name into the emptiness, while children pressed their ears against doors, eager to catch fragments of adult conversations they barely understood. Then came the discovery that would silence the town. George Bailey's body, not whole but dismembered, scattered in the lonely terrain of Breakheart Hill. The brutality of it stunned even the most hardened men. It was not only murder, it was desecration, and standing at the center of it all was John Best, whose every movement, every glance, seemed to confirm what people already believed, that he was capable of such a crime. Yet, as with all stories carved into history, clarity was elusive. Best denied involvement, his words wrapped in defiance, but the evidence, the whispers, and the mounting fear painted him guilty long before a trial was ever held. And so, in Franklin, a place once marked by stillness, Breakheart Hill became something more. The investigation into George Bailey's death unfolded not as a steady pursuit of evidence, but as a storm of urgency, pressure, and rumor, each wave pulling the town deeper into obsession. The sheriff's office became a stage for anxious faces, neighbors arriving with fragments of memory they believed might be important strange movements near the hill. Whispers of an argument in the tavern, the sight of John Best alone in the early hours of morning, his clothes disheveled and his expression unreadable. Each testimony felt like a piece of a puzzle, though no one could be certain if those pieces belonged to truth or imagination. In the absence of certainty, suspicion became fact, and fact hardened into conviction. The newspapers wasted no time. Headlines screamed of the Breakheart Hill horror, turning a small-town tragedy into a regional spectacle. Readers from miles away devoured each detail, painting the town of Franklin as a place torn between justice and dread. When John Best was taken into custody, shackled before a restless crowd, the air vibrated with something dangerous, both satisfaction and hunger for what would come next. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. Men leaned forward, their hats in their laps, while women clutched handkerchiefs against their lips, each person determined to etch every detail into memory. The prosecution painted Best as a monster in plain sight, a man capable of violence so brutal it defied imagination. They described the dismemberment not as an act of panic but as deliberate, methodical, the work of a man who wished not just to kill but to erase. The defense, struggling against the tide, argued there was no clear motive, no irrefutable proof linking Best to the crime beyond whispers and fear. But their words faltered against the gruesome evidence, against the sheer weight of the town's certainty. Even those outside the courthouse spoke as though the verdict was already sealed. It was less a question of guilt than of how swiftly the punishment should fall. And yet, beneath the surface of this collective judgment, questions remained unanswered. Why would Best choose such savagery? Why scatter the body in a place so close, so easily discovered? Was this the work of hatred, desperation, or madness? The jury would not wait for answers. They wanted resolution, not riddles, and their verdict would come not from the shadows of doubt, but from the roar of public demand. When the verdict came down, it landed like thunder in the courtroom. Guilty Courtney Best, guilty of the murder of George Bailey. The words were spoken with the weight of inevitability, as though the trial itself had been little more than ritual. A formality designed to satisfy procedure while the outcome had been decided long before. The townspeople erupted in a murmur of satisfaction, some whispering prayers of relief, others muttering curses at the condemned man. Best stood silent, his face pale yet unreadable, his eyes fixed not on the jurors or the judge, but somewhere far beyond, as if he had already stepped into the shadow of death. The sentence followed swiftly execution by hanging. Outside the courthouse, the news spread like wildfire, galloping across Franklin and into surrounding towns, each retelling sharpening the edges of the tale until Best's guilt felt like an eternal truth. Yet beneath the triumph of justice, doubts curled like smoke. Some whispered that the evidence had been circumstantial at best, that too much had been built on hearsay and the public's thirst for resolution. Others believed justice had been done, that the brutality of Bailey's dismembered body could belong to no other hand but Best's. On the morning of his execution, the air in Franklin was heavy, as though the town itself was holding its breath. Crowds gathered, not with solemnity but with the uneasy anticipation of spectators at a grim performance. Men climbed onto wagons for a better view, children clung to their mothers' skirts, and the silence that fell as Best was led to the gallows was sharper than any sermon. He was asked for final words, but what he gave was not confession, nor was it protest. He simply said, "The truth will remain, whether I am here or not." Then the rope tightened, the trap gave way, and John Best swung into eternity while the crowd exhaled as one, some relieved, others unsettled, all bound to the moment in memory. Yet death did not close the case as neatly as the court had promised. For years afterward, whispers continued to haunt the town. Some said they had seen another man near Breakheart Hill that night. Others swore Best had been framed, sacrificed. To appease the fevered need for closure, the hill remained a place of unease, where children dared each other to walk alone after dusk, where the echo of injustice or guilt seemed to linger in the rustle of leaves. Franklin moved on, but history did not forget. Breakheart Hill had claimed to live Bailey's, and Besant perhaps. In truth, neither crime had ever been solved. From Breakheart Hill in Massachusetts, where justice and doubt tangled like vines, we now move across the Atlantic to a quiet village in England, where another crime would unfold, not with axes or dismemberment, but with something more insidious, more invisible. It was the autumn of 1934 in the village of Shelford, Nottinghamshire, when the tale of Ethel Major began to coil into the newspapers. On the surface, it seemed like a domestic tragedy, a wife suddenly ill, a household shadowed by whispered suspicions of marital strife. Yet as the days passed and the whispers grew louder, the story revealed something darker. A crime that hid itself inside teacups and meals, where the act of murder was not a flash of violence but a slow, deliberate unraveling of life. Ethel Major was not a figure of notoriety before the crime. She was an ordinary woman in an ordinary marriage, so it appeared, but beneath that veneer was tension, suspicion, and betrayal. Ethel had become convinced her husband, Arthur, was unfaithful. It was a belief that gnawed at her, turning quiet domestic moments into fuel for paranoia. She began to plot in silence, her anger simmering in kitchens and parlors, until it took form in the most ancient weapon of all poison. In November of that year, Arthur fell suddenly ill, stricken with violent stomach pains that left him weak and writhing. At first, the symptoms seemed to point toward food poisoning, or perhaps some common illness, but the episodes repeated, each attack worse than the last. Doctors grew puzzled, family members grew concerned, and Ethel grew careful, her face a mask of worry while her hand reached again and again for the small container of weed killer she had hidden away. It was a chillingly calculated crime, one that relied not on brute force but on patience, deception, and the trust of a man who never believed the meal before him might be his undoing. Arthur's death was quiet compared to Bailey's in Massachusetts, yet in its quietness lay a horror just as sharp. The authorities soon suspected foul play, and what began as a domestic tragedy became a criminal investigation, one that pulled Ethel from her modest life and placed her under the glaring lights of scrutiny. In Shelford, the village people whispered, just as Franklin once had. But this time the whispers were of teapots and powders, of trust turned lethal, and of how murder can dwell unseen in the most ordinary of households. Arthur Major's final weeks were a portrait of suffering that defied explanation. He was a man in his 40s, once healthy and capable, now reduced to a shadow of himself, clutching at his stomach as waves of agony overtook him. Neighbors would later recall how he seemed to wither overnight, his face pale, his body trembling, his voice weak as he tried to push through the pain. The doctor who attended him, Dr. Ridley, prescribed treatments, but none brought relief. Every attempt at recovery seemed mocked by the return of violent spasms, vomiting, and collapse. Behind the closed doors of their home, Ethel played the part of a concerned wife. She fetched him blankets, brewed him teas, and called on medical help at the right moments. To the casual eye, it was devotion, but in truth, those small acts of care became the very delivery system of her plan. The tea that steamed in a cup, the broth spooned from a pot each, became the conduit for poison. Strychnine slipped in with a steady hand, a dose measured just shy of instantly fatal, allowing Arthur to suffer for weeks before death finally claimed him. Yet if her mask was convincing, suspicion was never far away. Arthur himself voiced his doubts. On more than one occasion, writhing in pain, he whispered to neighbors that he thought his wife was trying to kill him. These words were repeated, hushed but persistent, and soon the villagers began to look at Ethel differently. In a place where gossip traveled faster than truth, her reputation began to sour. The night of his death in November 1934, Arthur cried out in agony, convulsing until his body finally stilled. It was a death too violent, too grotesque to be mistaken for natural causes. The doctor, disturbed by the unnatural symptoms, refused to sign the death certificate. Instead, he alerted the authorities. An inquest was opened, and whispers hardened into accusations. Ethel, once just another wife in Shelford, now stood at the center of a brewing scandal. To some, she was a betrayed woman pushed too far. To others, she was a cold, deliberate poisoner who had turned her husband's meals into instruments of torment. And while Arthur lay in his grave, the soil still fresh above him, investigators began digging in. The death of Arthur Major did not vanish quietly into the village soil. His convulsions, his cries and his accusations carried weight, and soon the machinery of justice began to move. An inquest was ordered, and Arthur's body was exhumed. To disturb the dead was no small act in Shelford, but this was no ordinary case. When the coffin was pried open and the remains examined, the truth began to whisper from the flesh and bones left behind. The pathologist's scalpel revealed unmistakable signs of strychnine poisoning. The stiffness, the distortion of the body, the chemical traces preserved in tissues. What had once been speculation became science. Arthur's final hours had been written into his corpse, and those who studied it read the story with chilling clarity. He had been poisoned deliberately and repeatedly. Investigators turned their attention to the woman at the center of it all. Ethel Major, outwardly grieving, was anything but careless. She had not purchased strychnine in her own name, yet traces of her effort to conceal the crime began to emerge. Witnesses testified to her sharp tongue, her bitterness about Arthur's supposed unfaithfulness, her threats whispered in moments of rage. Others remembered Arthur himself, trembling and pale, insisting that his wife was slipping something into his food. The more authorities asked, the darker the picture became. But perhaps the most damning detail was the quiet fact that Ethel had opportunity alone with Arthur, tending to his meals, unobserved except for the victim himself. Circumstantial evidence stacked like bricks in a wall. The investigators pieced together her motive: humiliation over Arthur's wandering eye, anger sharpened into a kind of cold revenge. They outlined her method. Strychnine slipped in gradually, prolonging his suffering to the point of cruelty. And they saw her mask, a wife who summoned the doctor, who wept on cue, who appeared dutiful even as she orchestrated death. For the Crown, it was enough to bring charges. Ethel was arrested, her neighbors' eyes following her as constables led her away. The quiet village that once whispered about affairs now hummed with a darker gossip about murder, poison, and the woman who had hidden malice behind her teacups. What had been a private tragedy became a public scandal, and as she stood in the shadow of the law, the next chapter of her story would unfold, not in the home she had ruled, but in the courts where her fate would be decided. The trial of Ethel Major opened like a theatre production, with the eyes of Nottinghamshire and beyond fixed on the woman accused of turning a marriage bed into a deathbed. The courtroom was crowded, its benches filled with reporters, curious townsfolk, and legal minds eager to witness the drama. At the center of it all sat Ethel, dressed in dark, somber clothing, her face set in a mask of composure that unsettled as much as it intrigued. This was no weeping widow, no broken soul undone by loss. She was calm, even cold, and it was this very demeanor that began to shape the narrative in the jurors' minds. The prosecution painted her as a woman scorned, a wife who, rather than leave her unfaithful husband, chose to poison him slowly, making his last days a torment of muscle spasms and fear. They spoke of strychnine, a poison not stumbled upon, but purchased with intent. And they recounted the testimony of Arthur himself, his dying words, naming his wife as the author of his suffering. The defense sought to unravel that portrait, suggesting Arthur's accusations were the delirium of a man already dying, his mind unsteady, his body racked with agony. They argued that Ethel was no murderer but a victim of circumstance, dragged into suspicion because of marital quarrels and the callous whispers of neighbors. Yet as witnesses took the stand, the balance tipped. Friends recalled Arthur's insistence that his meals were tainted, his dread of being alone with his wife. The doctor described the unnatural convulsions, the stiffness that no ordinary illness could explain. And then came the science-chemical traces of strychnine, found in Arthur's remains, irrefutable and damning. Through it all, Ethel remained. Composed, her eyes cool, her voice steady when she was asked to speak. To some, it was dignity. To others, it was chilling proof of guilt. The jury watched her closely, measuring not just the words spoken in court but the silences. The way her hands never trembled, the way her grief seemed rehearsed. The public, outside the courthouse, whispered of her as though she were already condemned. Woman who wore widow's black but carried no true sorrow. When the gavel fell each day, she was escorted back to her cell. But the verdict was already forming in the minds of those who judged her. The trial was not only about poison and evidence. It was about her character, her demeanor, and whether the mask she wore was that of composure or calculation. The courtroom fell into a silence, so heavy it seemed to press against the walls as the jury filed back in. Hours had passed in deliberation, but to the spectators it felt like an eternity, the fate of Ethel Major hanging in the balance. The foreman stood, his voice steady, carrying the weight of finality. Guilty of murder. The words struck like a hammer blow, echoing in the hushed chamber. Ethel did not collapse or weep. She did not cry out or beg for mercy. She merely inclined her head slightly, her face as unreadable as ever, as though she had been expecting the outcome all along. The judge delivered the sentence with the formality of ritual, declaring that she was to be taken from this place and hanged by the neck until dead. Outside the courthouse, the news spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered in the streets, some satisfied that justice had been served, others whispering that a woman had been condemned more for her cold demeanor than for proof beyond doubt. Newspapers seized upon the drama, painting her as the Black Widow of Nottinghamshire, a woman whose heart had turned venomous, whose love had curdled into lethal hatred. For the townsfolk, the verdict was both shocking and strangely expected. They had watched the trial unfold like a grim morality play, and the conclusion seemed inescapable. Yet still, in parlors and pubs, voices rose in debate. Was she truly guilty, or was she a woman destroyed by gossip, judged not just for her actions, but for her silence, her refusal to display the emotions society demanded from widows? Among the more religious, her conviction was seen as divine justice, proof that sin, even hidden behind lace curtains and polite smiles, would eventually be exposed. For others, her fate raised uneasy questions about the fairness of trials shaped by character as much as evidence. In the weeks that followed, the shadow of her sentence loomed over the community. Women whispered of husbands who drank and strayed, wondering what might drive one to the brink of such vengeance. Men cast uneasy glances at their wives, aware that beneath quiet domestic routines could simmer resentment deeper than they understood. As for Ethel, she awaited her execution with the same composure she had shown throughout. No confession, no pleas, just silence. And in that silence, the legend of her guilt grew louder, filling the void with speculation, judgment, and fear. The days that followed her sentencing passed with an almost surreal stillness. Inside the cold stone walls of the women's prison, Ethel Major remained composed, her routine marked by silence and a quiet dignity that unsettled even the wardresses tasked with watching her. They whispered that she showed no fear, that she carried herself as if death were not a punishment but a destination she had already accepted. Some said she spent hours staring out through the narrow slit of her cell window, eyes fixed on a patch of sky no larger than a coin. Others claimed she hummed under her breath, low and tuneless, though none could ever quite make out the melody. When the chaplain visited, offering words of comfort and urging her toward repentance, she listened politely but gave no sign of spiritual struggle. She neither confessed nor denied, her lips remained sealed, her thoughts known only to herself. The morning of her execution dawned grey and windless, a heavy mist clinging to the prison yard as though the earth itself sought to veil what was about to occur. Outside, small groups of townspeople gathered, some driven by morbid curiosity, others by the hunger to see justice carried out. Inside, the officials moved with grim efficiency. At the appointed hour, the door to her cell opened. Ethel stood without resistance, dressed in black, her face pale but calm. She walked steadily, escorted by wardresses and the executioner, each step echoing against the flagstones in a rhythm that seemed too deliberate, too measured, for a woman walking to her death. When asked if she had any final words, she paused only for a moment before shaking her head. No speech, no revelation, no last protest of innocence or acceptance of guilt, only silence. As the noose was placed around her neck, witnesses described an uncanny composure, as though she was slipping into a role rehearsed long before. The lever was pulled, and with it, the chapter of her life closed. For those present, the silence afterward was deafening, heavier than the thud of the trapdoor or the creak of rope. Ethel Major was gone, but her mystery remained. Outside the prison, the fog lingered, as if reluctant to lift. And, in Nottinghamshire, people carried on their lives with a new story to tell, a tale of a woman who had met the gallows. In the weeks that followed her execution, Nottinghamshire found itself caught between relief and unease. Officially, justice had been served Ethel Major. The woman branded as the poisoner of Kirkby was gone, and with her the lingering tension that had gripped the county during her trial. But while the legal system closed the book on her story, the people did not. In village inns and at Sunday gatherings, her name surfaced again and again, retold with new inflections, new details, some rooted in fact, others born from the imagination of those who needed to explain the inexplicable. Some swore she had gone to the gallows, innocent, framed by circumstance and punished for the sin of silence. Others painted her as a calculating widow, a woman who planned every detail with cold precision and carried her secrets to the grave. And then there were the whispers that drifted into the realm of folklore, the kind of tales that stretched far beyond the facts. Children dared each other to walk past her old house at night, claiming to see a shadow in the upstairs window. Farmers spoke of hearing low, tuneless humming on misty mornings, as if her ghost still lingered, watching and waiting. Mothers told their daughters her story not as history, but as warning, a reminder that trust, love, and vengeance could blur into something deadly. Newspapers tried to move on, but her trial had left too deep an imprint. Columnists returned to it when anniversaries approached, and her photograph, stern-eyed and unsmiling, continued to surface in features about the most infamous women ever to face the gallows. Even decades later, when the memory of the crime itself faded, her name carried weight. In some circles, she became a symbol of mystery. Was she the victim of an unfaithful husband and cruel gossip, or was she the architect of her own dark fate? In others, she was a figure of fear, invoked to remind that evil can hide in plain sight. The story refused to die, carried forward in hushed voices, in folklore, in the way locals spoke of Kirkby and Ashfield with a sideways glance. Ethel Major had left the world in silence, but her silence was louder than words. echoing through generations. Each retelling added another layer, another possibility, another unanswered question. And so her legend grew, not in the courts or the records of law, but in the hearts and minds of those who could never quite let her go. From the shadowed lanes of Nottinghamshire, where Ethel Major's story refused to die, we shift across the Atlantic to a different time and a different kind of darkness. The year is 1900, and the place is Massachusetts, where a lonely hill earned a name that seemed almost too fitting for what would unfold: Breakheart Hill. It was a place that carried a strange weight, a slope that locals said could chill you, even on the warmest summer day, as though the land itself remembered grief. In the small, tightly knit communities nearby, trust was everything, and betrayal was unthinkable. But betrayal, as history reminds us, is often the root of the darkest crimes. This was the world of John Courtney Best, George Bailey, and Susie Young III, names that, at first glance, seemed ordinary enough. Yet together they formed the center of a tragedy that would end in death, dismemberment, and an execution that haunted Massachusetts for years to come. To understand this case, you have to picture the atmosphere of the era. The turn of the century was a time of transition. Horse-drawn carriages still clattered down dirt roads, gas lamps flickered on quiet streets, and telegraphs carried whispers faster than rumors could. But under that quaint exterior lay the same flaws and hungers that drive people even now: jealousy, love, ambition, and the desperate urge to keep secrets buried. George Bailey was a young man full of promise, well-liked, and yet destined for a fate as brutal as it was senseless. John Best, by contrast, was more complicated, charming in certain circles, unsettling in others. The kind of figure who seemed to hold back a piece of himself whenever he smiled. And then there was Susie Young, the quiet presence who, knowingly or not, became the hinge upon which everything would turn. Their story, like so many true crime tales, began with ordinary interactions, glances, friendships that might have meant little on another day, in another place. But at Breakheart Hill, every moment seemed to gather weight, like kindling waiting for the spark. And when the spark came, it set into motion a sequence that no one could stop. Tonight, as we step onto that hill and retrace their steps, we are not just entering a crime scene, we are entering the human heart at its most fragile and dangerous. George Bailey's disappearance was not immediate news. It began, like so many tragedies do, with a silence that stretched too long. He had last been seen walking with John Courtney Best, an ordinary meeting that should have raised no alarms, except for the fact that George never came back. Friends waited, family asked questions, and when the hours turned into days, the unease grew heavier. The Massachusetts countryside was not a place where young men simply vanished. The town knew its people, knew its rhythms, and when one of its sons failed to return, the air itself seemed to thicken with dread. Search parties formed, neighbors combed the woods, and whispers began to coil through parlors and taverns away, circling back to the same uneasy point. George had been with John Best. At first, this was spoken carefully, with hesitation. Best was not yet a villain in their eyes, merely the last person to share Bailey's company. But as days passed, suspicions sharpened like knives against a whetstone. Questions turned toward Best's behavior. Why had he been evasive when asked about that night? Why did his story shift in small, unsettling ways? His manner seemed too controlled, his tone too steady, as though rehearsed. Some said he showed no grief at Bailey's disappearance, only annoyance at the constant inquiries. And then there was Susie Young, a quiet figure at the edge of it all, her name whispered in the same breath as theirs. Some believed a triangle of affection had formed, silent, dangerous, and unbalanced, and that the weight of jealousy had been enough to push Bess toward something unspeakable. The town could not yet prove anything, but instinct ran deeper than evidence in those early days. The image of the two men together, walking into the dusk, only one returning, became a stain that would not fade. Families locked their doors earlier. Children were warned not to wander, and the once peaceful community found itself glancing over its shoulder. The sense of safety was gone. Breakheart Hill was no longer just a landmark, was becoming a wound, and people felt it throbbing beneath the surface of every conversation. The question was no longer, where is George Bailey? But what did John best do with him? And soon enough, that question would be answered in the most horrific way imaginable. The search ended in the most brutal way possible. George Bailey was not found wandering lost in the hills, nor lying injured in some ditch awaiting rescue. He was discovered in pieces, his body cut apart with a precision that seemed both methodical and monstrous. Scattered across the brush and soil of Breakheart Hill, his remains told a story that words could not soften. The men who stumbled upon him recoiled in horror, dropping their lanterns, their hands trembling as though they had touched something cursed. No one expected this. A missing man could be explained, but dismemberment, there was something that belonged to nightmares, not to a quiet Massachusetts town. The news spread like wildfire, each retelling more hushed, more horrified, as though speaking of it too loudly would summon the darkness again. Mothers clutched their children closer, fathers paced at night with rifles propped in corners, and the town square grew tense with eyes that refused to meet. People asked how such cruelty could exist in someone they thought they knew, for it was no longer speculation, it was fact. John Courtney Best had walked with George into the twilight, and only George had been left butchered on the hill. The shock was not only in the act, but in the implication. Dismemberment was not just murder, it was annihilation, a deliberate erasure of identity. Some whispered that Best had wanted to make sure no one could recognize George, to strip him of his humanity, to silence him forever. Others believed it was rage, uncontrolled and feral, a crime of passion that spilled over into savagery. Whatever the motive, the evidence was now undeniable. The town that had once wondered where George had gone now wished they had never asked. Best's name spread like a contagion, carried in hushed tones across dinner tables and prayer benches, until even those who had once defended him began to step away. Breakheart Hill had revealed its truth, and the truth was soaked in blood. The silence of the woods, the shadows that stretched across its paths, became unbearable reminders of the cruelty that had unfolded there. George Bailey was no longer just a missing man. He was a victim of a murder so grotesque that the town itself seemed to fracture under the weight of it. And with that discovery, suspicion hardened into something sharper, something that could no longer be ignored. Once George Bailey's dismembered remains were gathered, and the town's horror settled into a grim resolve. The gaze of suspicion narrowed onto John Courtney Best with suffocating intensity. He had been the last to see George alive, the one who walked beside him into the night, and though he swore he left George on the road to continue on alone, no one could reconcile that claim with the reality. Unearthed on Breakheart Hill, the investigators at the time had no modern tools, no fingerprints, no scientific certainty to lean upon. What they had were testimonies, inconsistencies, and the watchful eyes of a community unwilling to forget what it had seen. And they saw best his nervous demeanor, his shifting words, the way his story never seemed to hold steady under questioning. Rumors turned into whispers, whispers into outright accusations. Some townsfolk remembered old arguments between the two men, slights exchanged in taverns, hints of jealousy or debt. Others swore Best's temper had always been quick to rise, that it was only a matter of time before it boiled over into something catastrophic. The evidence itself was as circumstantial as it was damning. George's body was found on the very path they had taken together. The precision of the dismemberment seemed beyond random violence. It looked deliberate, intentional, perhaps even planned. Neighbors recalled seeing Best alone that night, his clothes dirtied, his hands bearing scratches he could not explain. When pressed, he offered excuses that sounded rehearsed, hollow, as if he were reciting a defense he had practiced in his mind but could not anchor in truth. The weight of suspicion became unbearable. Breakheart Hill itself seemed to accuse him, its soil-stained, its silence now heavy with judgment. And yet, some resisted the tide. They argued that suspicion was not proof, that anger and grief were twisting perception into certainty. But as days turned into weeks, and no other suspect emerged, the town grew restless. It demanded closure, demanded a name to attach to the horror. John Courtney Best's name was the only one that fit, the only one that lingered on everyone's lips when the lanterns dimmed and the fires crackled low. Justice in 1900 was often less about evidence and more about the weight of belief, and in this town, belief had already chosen its culprit. Best could feel it in every glance, every word spoken just low enough for him to hear. He was not simply accused, he was condemned in the minds of his neighbors long before a trial was ever set. When the sheriff finally placed his hand on John Courtney Best's shoulder and declared him under arrest, the moment seemed less an act of law than the inevitable conclusion of a story already written in the minds of the townspeople. The sound of boots striking against cobblestones followed him as he was marched through the streets of Massachusetts, his wrists bound in iron, his face pale but defiant. Crowds gathered not in silence but in muttering waves of anger, grief, and curiosity. Women clutched their children tighter as he passed, as though the taint of murder might spill from his shadow onto their lives. Men shouted accusations, some throwing stones and curses, as though their fury could rewrite the horror of Breakheart Hill. Yet Best walked on, lips pressed into a thin line, denying nothing, confessing nothing. His silence enraged some, intrigued others. To them, he was either a cold-blooded killer too, proud to admit his crime, or a falsely accused man swallowing injustice with grim resolve. At the sheriff's office, the questions began immediately. Where had he been? Why had he lied about when he last saw George Bailey? Why had his hands carried scratches that matched the thorns along the hill's edge? Best gave answers that sounded careful, too careful, rehearsed in the way a drowning man rehearses a prayer. But suspicion had already hardened into a verdict in the town's heart. The newspapers were quick to seize the story, each headline a sharpened blade, brutal dismemberment. On Breakheart Hill, John Best held in ghastly murder. The more ink spilled across the pages, the darker his image became. Reporters painted him as a cunning figure, a man capable of luring a companion into the night only to strike with merciless precision. Whether true or not mattered little. Words had power, and the public devoured them eagerly. As the trial date loomed, preparations took on the air of ritual. Witnesses were called, evidence laid out, and Best's name became synonymous with blood and betrayal. For the community, the trial was not just about justice, it was about purging the horror that had seeped into their soil. And for John Best, it was the beginning of a descent into a place from which no man had ever returned unchanged. The gallows loomed, even if they had not yet been built. The courtroom where John Courtney Best was brought to stand trial did not feel like a hall of justice. It felt like a theatre where every seat was filled by those eager to witness the unraveling of a man's fate. The wooden benches groaned under the weight of neighbours, townsfolk, strangers who had travelled from miles away simply to see the accused murderer of Breakheart Hill. The air was heavy with heat and whispers, the kind of stifling tension that made every cough, every scrape of a boot against the floor, sound louder than it should. When Best entered, escorted by guards, all eyes turned as though gravity itself had pulled their gaze. He was clean-shaven, dressed neatly, the image of composure. Yet his stillness only deepened the aura of menace the crowd projected upon him. To some, his calm demeanor was proof of his cold-heartedness. To others, it was the mask of innocence. The prosecution wasted no time painting him in the darkest colors. They described George Bailey as a young man full of promise, betrayed by one he trusted. They laid out the gruesome details with deliberate precision: the bloodied earth, the severed remains, the marks of violence, and then turned those images into a weapon pointed squarely at Best. Every word struck the jury like a drumbeat, building a rhythm of guilt that was hard to escape. Witnesses were called, their testimonies weaving a net around the accused. A neighbor swore he had heard cries near Breakheart Hill that night. Another claimed to have seen Best moving in the shadows, carrying something heavy. Even the scratches on his hands were presented as scars of violence, undeniable proof of his struggle with Bailey. Best's defense, thin and desperate, tried to suggest alternative explanations, but the courtroom did not seem interested in doubt. The story had already been chosen, and Best was cast as its villain. The newspapers fed the fire daily, their ink spreading fear and certainty beyond the courthouse walls. Families at breakfast tables, workers in factories, farmers in their fields, spoke of the trial as though they themselves were jurors. And through it all, Best remained the same, silent, watchful, occasionally meeting the eyes of those who stared at him with hatred. He was not just on trial for murder. He was on trial for the very idea of betrayal, the crime of turning friendship into slaughter. The verdict seemed to echo before it was ever spoken. When the final arguments concluded, the silence that descended upon the courtroom was heavier than the gavel itself. The jury, 12 solemn faces lined with fatigue, filed into their chamber to decide the fate of John Courtney Best. Outside, the townspeople gathered in restless clusters, their voices low but urgent, carrying a single theme: justice must be served. Inside the deliberation room, the jurors weighed the evidence with the gravity of men and women who knew their decision would not only determine one man's life, but also define the moral order of their community. Hours passed, and the courtroom remained in suspended animation, every tick of the clock sounding like a hammer against iron. When the jury finally returned, their expressions were grim, their eyes unflinching. The foreman rose, voice steady as he read the words that had already been whispered in every corner of Massachusetts. Guilty of murder in the first degree. The sound that followed was not a gasp, but a low collective exhale, as though the entire room had been holding its breath and now released it in unison. Best stood unmoving, his face neither triumphant nor broken, a mask carved in stone. The judge pronounced a sentence execution by hanging on. The weight of those words lingered like smoke long after the gavel fell. Some in the gallery nodded in satisfaction, convinced they had witnessed the rightful end of a monster. Others felt a gnawing unease, for no matter how gruesome the crime, the act of condemning a man to death left its own shadow. Newspapers the next morning carried headlines that rang with finality. Best to hang for Breakheart Hill murder. They spoke of justice restored, of vengeance for the slain, of order returned to a shaken town. But beneath the ink and paper, questions stirred in hushed voices. Had every piece of evidence truly been certain? Was Best the cold-blooded killer they had been told he was? Or was there something more hidden beneath the surface of Breakheart Hill, something the trial had not revealed for the moment? None of that mattered. The machinery of justice had spoken, and its gears would not stop turning until the noose was tied, the trapdoor released, and the story of Best ended with the finality of a body falling into silence. Yet even as the verdict echoed, the mystery of George Bailey's death did not feel fully solved. The morning of the execution dawned grey, as if the sky itself refused to show the brilliance of the sun on such a day. A low fog curled over the Massachusetts landscape, shrouding the prison walls in a pall that seemed designed for death. Long before the appointed hour, crowds had gathered outside, their breath clouding in the cold air, their conversations hushed but bristling with anticipation. To some, the hanging was just as swift, deserved a necessary act to close the wound, carved by the Breakheart Hill murder. To others, it was a grim spectacle, a reminder that the state could be as merciless as the criminal it condemned. Inside, John Courtney Best prepared himself with the kind of stoic resignation that unsettled even the guards. He accepted a final meal but ate little, drank a single glass of water, and spent his last hours in silence, eyes fixed on some unseen horizon. When the executioner came, Best walked with measured steps, his chains clinking against the stone corridor like a funereal drumbeat. The scaffold awaited, its timbers stark and unyielding, the noose swaying slightly in the morning wind. The crowd pressed forward, faces pale, eyes wide, every man and woman straining for a glimpse of history being written in flesh and rope. As Best mounted the steps, he paused for a brief moment, scanning the crowd with an expression impossible to decipher. Some claimed they saw defiance, others said remorse, and still others whispered it was simply emptiness, the gaze of a man already halfway gone. The executioner adjusted the rope, secured the knot, and pulled the hood over Best's head. Silence rippled outward like a wave, falling over the spectators until even the rustle of clothing ceased. The final words of the sheriff rang out, pronouncing the sentence of the Commonwealth. Then came the sound that would echo in memory, the sharp crack of the trapdoor releasing, the abrupt drop, the body jerking once before hanging still. A murmur moved through the crowd, some crossing themselves, some turning away, others staring with a grim satisfaction. The official doctor stepped forward, placed fingers against the still form, and after a tense moment declared death. The crowd dispersed slowly, conversations rising again but carrying with them an unshakable heaviness. Best was gone, but the murder of George Bailey and the secrets of Breakheart Hill still haunted the air. For in the final act of justice, the question remained: had the truth been buried along with the man who swung at dawn? In the days following the execution, Massachusetts remained suspended in a strange, uneasy quiet. The people who had lined the streets, watched from windows, and whispered in the fog-shrouded corners of towns returned to their lives. Yet the shadow of Breakheart Hill lingered like smoke that refused to dissipate. Newspapers carried vivid accounts, some factual, others dripping with sensationalism, describing Best's final moments, the jerking of his body on the scaffold, the pallid expressions of the crowd. Families debated morality at kitchen tables, neighbors argued in hushed tones on street corners, and children, too young to fully understand, caught fragments of conversation about a man who had committed horrors unspeakable. Some residents insisted that justice had been served, that the state had acted decisively to close the chapter of horror left by George Bailey's death. Others whispered doubts, uneasy murmurs about whether Best had acted alone, whether some hidden accomplice had escaped justice. The air itself seemed to remember the crime, the rustle of leaves along the hill carrying an echo of footsteps that had vanished long before the scaffold was built. Historians would later point to Breakheart Hill as a case that gripped the public imagination, a tale of obsession, betrayal, and violence that seemed almost operatic in its intensity. Psychologists would speculate about the mind of Best, about what drives a man to commit acts that shock the very foundation of community, and why others are drawn to witness, almost as if caught in a morbid trance. The land itself seemed scarred. The hilltop where George Bailey had vanished, remaining a place avoided by those who knew the story. Whispered warnings passed from one generation to the next. Travelers who passed through Massachusetts in subsequent years reported a certain chill near the old prison and Breakheart Hill, an inexplicable weight pressing upon the shoulders, a sense that history had left a mark far deeper than any stone or blood could signify. And through it all, questions lingered. Had the execution ended the story, or had it merely transformed it into legend? Did the echoes of screams and whispered confessions vanish with Best, or did they settle into the land itself, waiting for the next curious soul to uncover them? The tale of Breakheart Hill would persist, etched into memory and ink, a dark testament to the fragility of justice and the enduring pull of a crime that refuses to be forgotten. A story that would haunt those who dared to speak its name long after the scaffold had been dismantled. Even after Best's death, whispers continued to slither through Massachusetts, rumors that refused to be silenced. Some claimed that George Bailey's disappearance had been orchestrated by more than one pair of hands, that Best was merely the visible tip of a submerged, twisted network of secrets. Others suggested that the victim had been lured into a trap by someone he trusted, someone who smiled in daylight while plotting in darkness. Townsfolk spoke of letters that never arrived, of shadows glimpsed in windows where no one should have been, of late-night visitors who left as silently as they came. Local authorities maintained that the case was closed, yet investigators' private notes hinted at unanswered questions, footprints that didn't match Best's boots, conversations overheard but never fully documented, and an assortment of objects discovered in the woods near Breakheart Hill whose origin was never explained. Some researchers believe these anomalies point to a larger conspiracy, perhaps a second accomplice who vanished into the fog, leaving the crime incomplete but not forgotten. Others suggest that these were fabrications, stories grown from fear and fascination, a community's attempt to make sense of horror that had no easy explanation. Even decades later, the hill retained its ominous reputation. Hikers reported sudden drops in temperature, a faint rustle in the underbrush, and the occasional fleeting sensation of being watched, as if the memory of violence had seeped into the soil itself. Psychologists examining the case pondered the ways collective memory can distort truth, creating specters that blur the line between reality and legend. Yet, for some, the more mysterious details only deepened the intrigue, drawing historians and thrill-seekers alike to explore the place where Best and Bailey's stories intersected. Could there have been letters never sent, hidden diaries, or confessions buried beneath the forest floor? Or were these mere constructions of imagination, feeding on the fertile ground of a society obsessed with the macabre? Theories multiply. Secret liaisons, hidden debts, unspoken rivalries or shadows that might have shaped the events at Breakheart Hill but remain forever out of reach. And as night falls on the region, with the wind whispering through skeletal branches, one question persists. Echoing across time, did justice end with the scaffold? Or did it only mark the beginning of a story far more complex, woven into the very fabric of the hill, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to uncover what truly lies beneath? The mystery endures, and the answers, if they exist, Breakheart Hill did not remain merely a site of historical crime. Over the years, it became a breeding ground for whispers, tales, and folklore that danced along the edges of fear. Locals spoke of shadowy figures, glimpsed at twilight, moving silently among the gnarled trees, as if retracing the final steps of George Bailey. Children dared one another to approach the hill, only to return wide-eyed, insisting they had heard whispers calling their names, or felt icy fingers brush their shoulders. Some hikers reported seeing fleeting shapes at the edge of their vision, pale and indistinct, vanishing when looked at directly. These stories, whether born from genuine fear or imagination, took root and spread, coloring the hill with a supernatural aura. Tavern conversations, letters in dusty archives, and diary entries often blurred the line between documented events and spectral rumor, creating a tapestry of mystery that enveloped the entire region. Some theorists claimed that the hill itself seemed cursed, a place where misfortune lingered long after the crime, affecting those who dared to live or wander nearby. Others dismissed these accounts as collective paranoia, the human mind imposing patterns and narratives on the random and unexplained, a psychological echo of the horror that occurred decades before. Yet, even skeptics could not deny the intensity of the reports. Unexplained noises that mimicked footsteps, lanterns flickering with no source, cold drafts that seemed to travel against the wind. The stories evolved over generations, transforming the memory of violence into legend, as if the hill demanded acknowledgement of its dark past. Ghost hunters and curiosity seekers arrived, armed with cameras and recording devices, hoping to capture evidence of what many insisted lingered unseen. Some left with nothing, yet the allure persisted, growing stronger with each tale shared. In hushed tones, the line between history and myth blurred further, as Breakheart Hill became a symbol not just of a single crime, but of human fascination with the unknown, a place where reality and fear intertwined. The mystery, now layered with folklore, beckoned with an irresistible pull, inviting each new visitor to question what is seen, what is felt, and what remains hidden. And as the wind whistles through the skeletal branches at night, the hill seems to whisper an age-old question: who truly haunts whom, the living or the memories left behind? The investigation into George Bailey's disappearance and John Best's involvement was meticulous for its time. Yet even today it leaves unsettling questions that refuse to settle. Official records describe how law enforcement combed the countryside, interrogated neighbors, and gathered fragments of evidence that pointed in one direction. But some pieces never fit neatly into the puzzle. Witness accounts were contradictory. Some insisted they saw Best near the hill at odd hours. Others swore he was elsewhere entirely. His alibi imperfect yet persuasive. Skeptics have noted that the technology and forensic methods of the early 1900s were rudimentary, leaving vast gaps that modern eyes struggle to reconcile. Items recovered from the hill, shreds of clothing, traces of blood, and personal effects were catalogued with care. Yet the provenance of each remained uncertain. Could these have belonged to Bailey, or were they remnants of other misfortunes? Some researchers argue that Best was meticulous, calculating, and possibly assisted by unseen accomplices, raising questions about whether the official narrative captured the full scope of events. Letters and diaries from the period hint at local tensions, disputes over property, and whispers of revenge that could have motivated actions beyond what the investigators understood. Even the trial, lauded as a triumph of justice at the time, now appears clouded by inconsistencies, testimonies that shifted, evidence that vanished, and a conviction that relied as much on circumstantial pressure as on hard fact. Historians continue to debate whether justice was truly served, or whether a combination of fear, rumor, and societal pressures steered the outcome. Some modern criminologists speculate that the case contained elements that contemporary psychology might classify as sociopathic manipulation, yet the full truth remains obscured by the passage of time. Every new document unearthed, every re-examination of the crime scene photographs, seems to open more questions than answers, suggesting that the case was never a closed chapter, merely one layer of a much deeper enigma. For those who wander the archives, piecing together fragments of testimony and police notes, the story becomes less about certainty and more about understanding the shadows that lurk between fact and interpretation, the unanswered questions, what ifs, and could it base linger like a persistent echo, haunting not just Breakheart Hill, but anyone who dares to step too close to its legacy. And as the records fade and the witnesses vanish, one is left with a chilling realization. Some mysteries may never surrender their secrets, and the truth may be far stranger than any theory proposed. Beyond the official investigation, Hill was rife with whispers that seemed to follow anyone who dared linger too long. Locals spoke of strange figures seen near the edges of the forest, silhouettes that vanished when approached, leaving only the rustle of dead leaves and a sense of unease. Rumors suggested that John Best may not have acted alone, that someone or perhaps multiple people helped orchestrate the events that led to George Bailey's disappearance. Some recounted glimpses of unfamiliar carriages arriving at odd hours. Others mentioned shadowy visitors who slipped through the town unnoticed. Over time, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Several disappearances in the surrounding area, each seemingly unconnected, yet bearing subtle similarities to Bailey's case. Some researchers theorize that these were opportunistic crimes, using the chaos surrounding Bailey's fate as a cover. Others suggest something more deliberate, a network of silent complicity hidden beneath the town's quiet surface. Diaries recovered decades later hint at secret alliances, grudges buried beneath polite facades, and conversations interrupted by hurried footsteps and nervous glances. Even the innkeepers and local shopkeepers, who were often the most observant, recalled late-night visitors asking strange questions, examining maps of the hills, or requesting directions to places that seemed to exist only in whispers. These fragments of memory, combined with sporadic letters and police notes, create an impression of a wider web of intrigue, one that the original investigators may have glimpsed but never fully unraveled. Forensic limitations at the time left many clues invisible to the law, and some scholars suggest that critical evidence was overlooked, lost, or deliberately ignored, leaving gaps that fuel speculation to this day. The townspeople's stories, once dismissed as superstition or fear-driven exaggeration, gain a disturbing plausibility when seen against the backdrop of multiple unsolved disappearances, hints of hidden accomplices, and the chilling knowledge that George Bailey's fate may have been only the beginning of something darker. Even now, walking the paths near Breakheart Hill, one can feel a tension in the air, a lingering suspicion that the earth holds more than just soil and rock, that secrets of human malice lie buried beneath layers of time and silence. And as we consider the possibility of unseen collaborators and unexplained vanishings, a haunting question emerges. What else remains hidden in the trial of John Courtney best drew attention far beyond the quiet town surrounding Breakheart Hill, transforming a local horror into a spectacle that gripped the state. From the moment Best stepped into the courtroom, whispers filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of ink, wood polish, and anxious anticipation. Reporters scribbled feverishly, eager to capture every expression, every pause, every flicker of emotion that might hint at guilt or innocence. The prosecution painted a vivid, almost cinematic picture of the crime: Bailey's disappearance, the dismemberment, the evidence found in the surrounding woods, and the chilling logic that led them to Best. They emphasized his strange behaviors, the late-night excursions, the sudden purchases, and the unsettling calm he displayed when questioned, weaving a narrative that left little room for doubt in the public's mind. Yet, defense attorneys countered with meticulously, almost obsessive attention to detail, highlighting inconsistencies in witness statements, the limits of forensic science, and the possibility of unseen accomplices. They questioned the reliability of local testimony, pointing out the fear and hysteria that had gripped the town, suggesting that collective imagination had amplified suspicion into certainty. Outside the courtroom, the town itself seemed to divide. Some saw Best as a monster, a man who violated the very fabric of civility, while others whispered of wrongful accusation, pointing to the shadows that lingered too long over Breakheart Hill, hinting at secrets beyond one man's control. The courtroom became a theater of tension, where glances carried meaning, where silence could speak louder than words, and where each piece of evidence became a brushstroke in a larger, darker painting. Jurors faced immense pressure, aware that their verdict would not only decide Best's fate, but shape the town's history for generations. Spectators too were caught in the drama, their reactions a silent chorus that swayed like a pendulum with each new revelation. And even as witnesses testified, describing the horrors they had seen or imagined, an underlying question lingered in the air. How much of the truth could be uncovered within these walls, and how much would remain buried in rumor, fear, and the unforgiving darkness beyond the courthouse doors? The trial would end, as all trials do, with a verdict. Yet the echoes of suspicion, tension, and unease would continue to reverberate far beyond the gavel, leaving the town and the world watching to wonder whether justice had truly been served, or merely staged. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, a collective pulse caught between relief, horror, and anticipation. Guilty. The word fell like a hammer, reverberating through the wood-paneled walls, through the rows of spectators, and deep into the hearts of those who had watched the story unfold from distant corners of Massachusetts. For John Courtney Best, the world shifted abruptly, the cacophony of public opinion crashing over him with an intensity that left no room for subtlety or nuance. In the days that followed, he was confined to a small, cold cell where time stretched and warped, each hour marked by the distant echo of footsteps, the scraping of keys, and the quiet hum of anxious guards. Letters arrived sporadically, some from supporters who whispered that the evidence had been circumstantial, that fear had dictated judgment, and others from strangers who expressed relief or satisfaction, their words tinged with the unyielding certainty of those who believe evil wears a familiar face. Within the walls of confinement, Best confronted the isolation that accompanies finality, the stark separation between public condemnation and private contemplation. Friends and neighbors, once familiar faces, now passed silently by the courthouse or prison gates, eyes averted or heavy with judgment. Some whispered, speculating on his inner thoughts, imagining confession, denial, or despair, while others recoiled, fearful of the shadow of guilt that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. As the days grew shorter and the inevitable date of execution approached, the tension between public spectacle and private reality intensified. Guards noted the quiet moments when Best stared at walls, at the sky, at the faint light filtering through barred windows, perhaps reflecting on what had led him here, perhaps calculating what would be left behind in whispers, rumors, and the fragmented memories of those who had known him. And all the while, the town waited, its collective heartbeats synchronizing with the slow march toward finality, knowing that the story would end with a ritual, a pronouncement, and yet also understanding that the moral, the fear, and the mystery would linger far longer than any sentence could contain. The verdict had closed one chapter, but the questions, the unease, and the darkness surrounding Breakheart Hill, and the life of John Courtney Best would continue to echo, leaving an indelible mark on history, human conscience, and the imagination of all who dared to look too closely at the shadows behind the headlines. The morning of John Courtney Best's execution arrived with a cold, almost surgical precision, a day marked by the quiet rustle of papers, the clink of metal keys, and the low murmur of officials carrying out their duties with solemn detachment. Outside the prison walls, townspeople gathered in uneasy clusters, a mixture of morbid curiosity, relief, and lingering dread painting their faces. Some spoke in hushed tones about the horror of the murders, others debated the justice of the verdict, and a few quietly questioned the morality of witnessing a life extinguished in the name of law. Within the execution chamber, the atmosphere was taut, each sound amplified, the shuffle of boots on stone, the metallic click of restraints, the faint whisper of a guard checking procedures. Best himself appeared calm, almost eerily composed, his gaze steady but unreadable, as if he had surrendered fully to the inevitable. Or perhaps he carried a secret inside, a final defiance that no public opinion or legal decree could touch. The executioner moved with deliberate efficiency, performing each motion that had been rehearsed countless times, the instruments cold and unforgiving under the harsh light. As the sentence was carried out, there was a moment of suspended reality, a single breath, a heartbeat, a flicker of life fading to stillness, before the mechanical processes of closure resumed, the world moving on as though nothing had changed. Outside, the town reacted in ways that revealed the complexity of human conscience, relief intertwined with unease, satisfaction shadowed by the stark confrontation with mortality, and whispers of justice served, mingling with the subtle acknowledgement of something lost, something irrevocably altered in their collective psyche. In homes and taverns, people discussed what they had witnessed or imagined, stories taking on the shape of legend even as facts were recounted, each retelling adding layers of horror, curiosity, and speculation. Scholars and journalists, arriving weeks later, pieced together accounts, noting the peculiarities of Best's demeanor, the contradictory reports of last words, the ambiguous reactions of those who had known him. And while the law had executed its sentence, the narrative refused closure, stubbornly alive in the memories of those who lived through it, and in the quiet, dark corners of Breakheart Hill itself, where the echoes of that fateful summer still lingered. Justice, punishment, fear, fascination all intertwined in a final tableau, leaving an indelible imprint on history, on the human imagination, and on the whispered tales told late at night by those who could not quite. Even after John Courtney Best had been executed, Breakheart Hill refused to relinquish its secrets. The gruesome memories of George Bailey and Susie Young's fates lingered like a fog that never fully lifted, and townsfolk reported whispers of strange occurrences that no one could explain, doors left ajar in abandoned houses, fleeting shadows in the corners of their vision, the faint scent of smoke or damp earth where no fire or rain had been. Some researchers believe these were the remnants of a collective trauma, the human mind's way of trying to comprehend the incomprehensible, while others suggest there were more tangible echoes of Best's presence, a lingering malevolence that could not be captured by law or logic. Curious historians and amateur detectives visited the hill, hoping to trace the final steps of the killer, to uncover overlooked clues in the weeds and moss-covered stones, and yet they often left with more questions than answers. Diaries and letters discovered years later hinted at motives and patterns that were never fully understood. Fragments of Best's psyche glimpsed in fragmented sentences, confessions written in the dead of night, a mind as twisted as the landscape he had. Terrorized, from one story to the next, inconsistencies emerged, differing accounts of the victim's last hours, the precise locations where bodies had been found, even conflicting interpretations of Best's behavior during interrogations. Some locals swear that the echo of George Bailey's laughter roar was at a scream, can still be heard on windy nights, carried through the bare branches of skeletal trees, and that Susie Young's name surfaces unexpectedly in dreams, as if the past refuses to sleep. Theories about accomplices, overlooked evidence, and possible miscarriages of justice swirled in whispers among those brave enough to ponder them, each new interpretation feeding the legend rather than resolving it. And yet, amid this uncertainty, there is an undeniable fascination, a compulsion to peer into the darkness, to imagine the unknown, to confront the uncomfortable truths about human cruelty and the fragility of life. Some suggest that Hill itself holds the answers, buried beneath layers of soil, memory, and fear, waiting for someone willing to face the lingering shadows. Others warn that certain truths are never meant to be uncovered, that some histories remain deliberately obscured, haunting us precisely because they cannot be fully explained. The final word may never be spoken, the full story never told, leaving a space where curiosity meets dread, where history bleeds into legend, and where the memory of Best, his victims, and the horrors they endured continues to echo quietly, insistently, as if urging the living to remember, to question, and to wonder what really happened on Breakheart Hill. Breakheart Hill did not simply vanish from memory with the closing of the trial. Its shadows seeped into the fabric of the town, shaping lives, fears, and stories for decades. Children grew up hearing hushed whispers of George, Bailey, and Susie. Young cautionary tales told at the dinner table or around schoolyard fires, their innocence tinged with a subtle, persistent unease. Some historians suggest that entire families carried an unspoken anxiety, an inherited vigilance, a collective understanding that evil could arrive quietly, unnoticed, in the midst of ordinary life. Others point to a darker explanation, the psychological trauma of witnessing, or even simply learning of such horrors, embeds itself in memory like a virus, passing from one generation to the next through stories, behaviors, and the subtle shaping of community norms. The houses near Breakheart Hill were often left vacant for years, their windows boarded up, gardens untended, doors creaking with the weight of silence. Locals avoided certain trails, certain shadows, and in some cases, the simplest of events. A stranger moving into a nearby home became a source of immediate suspicion, a reflection of a town that had been trained to anticipate malice. Some researchers believe that this heightened caution may have saved lives in the decades that followed, while others argue it stifled the town's growth, leaving an invisible scar on both commerce and social life. As new generations arrived, some attempted to rationalize the events, to explain them through statistics, criminal psychology, or social pressures of the era, but a lingering uncertainty always persisted. The hill, the forest, the abandoned streets became symbols, metaphors for the unknown that waits beyond the edges of daily life. A reminder that human evil can be as quiet as it is sudden. Stories of haunted houses or whispered sightings of figures moving through the trees circulated like a low hum of folklore, merging the factual and the imagined, ensuring that the memory of John Courtney Best's crimes never faded completely. Even in modern times, visitors report a sensation of being watched, a subtle pull toward the heart of the hill, as if the land itself remembers and reacts to intrusions. The past, it seems, does not remain confined to history books. It bleeds into the present, affecting behavior, shaping perception, and keeping the story alive, quietly, persistently, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon it, to ask the same haunting question: what really happened at Breakheart Hill, and can evil ever truly be contained? In the decades following the trial and execution of John Courtney Best, Breakheart Hill transformed from a place of immediate horror into a subject of intrigue for researchers, amateur sleuths, and true crime enthusiasts alike. The hill itself became a silent witness to countless investigations, some scientific, some speculative, and some purely obsessive. Modern forensic techniques, previously unimaginable in 1900, were applied retrospectively to archival evidence, handwriting analysis of letters and notes, soil sampling from areas where remains were discovered, and digital reconstructions of the crime scenes. Some researchers claim these efforts reveal new patterns, subtle clues that were overlooked, possibly suggesting the presence of accomplices, or even crimes that were never reported. Others caution against drawing definitive conclusions, noting that the gaps in historical records make certainty impossible, and that some patterns may be the product of imagination rather than evidence. Local archives, once dusty and ignored, became treasure troves for historians. Photographs, property deeds, and newspaper clippings shed light on the social networks surrounding Best, Bailey, and Young, hinting at hidden tensions, secret alliances, and rivalries that may have fueled or obscured the violence. New witness accounts, descendants' testimonies, and private diaries surfaced unexpectedly, complicating the narrative and challenging the long-standing understanding of the case. Some accounts suggest that George Bailey's disappearance was not entirely a product of Best's malice, but was entwined with local disputes and betrayals, adding layers of human complexity to the story. Others hold that these discoveries are merely echoes of mythologizing, an attempt to fill in the darkness left by incomplete records. What is undeniable is that Breakheart Hill retains its grip on imagination and research, drawing visitors, scholars, and thrill-seekers to its slopes, where whispers of the past merge with the wind through the trees. Some report finding evidence of old markers, personal belongings, and remnants of structures long vanished, reinforcing the idea that the hill is more than a mere setting. It is a living archive of human tragedy, a place where history, memory, and imagination intersect. As cameras flash, notebooks are filled, and digital timelines are constructed, one question remains persistent, haunting each new inquiry. Despite every discovery, every modern technique, every painstaking reconstruction, can we ever fully know what truly happened on Breakheart Hill? As the sun sets over Breakheart Hill and the surrounding town, casting long shadows over deserted streets and abandoned homes, we are reminded that some stories are never truly finished. The case of John Courtney Best, George Bailey, and Susie Young exists not only in the pages of history, but also in the collective imagination of a community forever altered by fear, tragedy, and unanswered questions. Sit back, relax, and consider the subtle ways in which history persists: the creak of an old floorboard, the faint outline of a once-tended garden, the whispered warnings passed from parent to child. Some researchers continue to dig into archives, scanning for new evidence or overlooked anomalies, while others explore psychological, social, and cultural explanations for the violence that unfolded. Theories multiply, each one plausible, each one incomplete, creating a tapestry of uncertainty that only deepens the intrigue. Beyond the hill itself, the story reverberates into broader discussions about human nature, morality, and the often hidden darkness that can reside within ordinary lives. Every new account, every surviving document, every trace of memory adds texture, complexity, and, ultimately, more questions than answers. Those who visit Breakheart Hill or study the case are confronted with a sense of unease, a reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a living, breathing entity shaped by perception, interpretation, and imagination. As we conclude this journey through one of America's most chilling historical crimes, we must acknowledge the tension between what is known and what may forever remain a mystery. Some argue that the true horror lies not in the acts themselves, but in the uncertainty that lingers, the realization that evil can go undetected, unresolved, and unpunished in ways both small and profound. Others suggest that the fascination persists because we see in these stories a reflection of our own vulnerabilities, our fear of the unknown, and our relentless desire to seek answers where perhaps none exist. Breakheart Hill remains a testament to the intertwining of fact, memory, and legend, a place where shadows endure longer than light, and where the whispers of the past continue to call out to those willing to listen. And so, the story does not end. Here it merely waits, patient and silent, for the next curious mind, the next intrepid historian, or the next wandering soul to step onto the hill and ask, once more, what really happened in that forgotten corner of Massachusetts.